Hillary Clinton sat with her ankles crossed beneath the heavy oak table, her hands perfectly folded in front of her, embodying the posture of a seasoned political veteran who had commanded more hearing rooms than most of the committee members had spent days in government service. She had just laughed on camera about the utter destruction of a sovereign nation, flashing a practiced smile that had been meticulously deployed in rooms exactly like this one for 3 long decades. These were rooms filled with glaring cameras, omnidirectional microphones, and ambitious men who foolishly believed they possessed the strategic gravity to rattle her composure. "I want to begin by acknowledging the Secretary's enthusiasm," she stated, letting the thinly veiled condescension hang in the sterile air of the Capitol. She noted that he had been in his role for a conspicuously short time, yet had already conducted more press conferences than most seasoned secretaries deliver in a full term. Then came the pause, not the measured cadence of an Obama speech, but a distinctively sharp Clinton pause, brief and lethal, like a blade being slowly turned in a profound silence. "I admire the energy," she remarked, her tone dripping with the patronizing assumption that he possessed the frantic energy of a novice who had not yet grasped that global foreign policy is neither a campaign speech nor a fleeting tweet nor a televised press conference. "It is," she asserted, "the hardest and most deeply consequential work a person can ever undertake, and it emphatically does not become easier simply because one talks loudly about it." She straightened her neatly stacked papers in a deliberate, theatrical gesture performed entirely for the benefit of the room, asserting that during her tenure as Secretary of State, she was the one who made the excruciatingly difficult decisions that ostensibly kept the country safe. She admitted she did not do it flawlessly, but claimed she operated under the immense weight of responsibility that only comes from actually sitting in the executive chair. Her smile returned, noticeably thinner and more precise than before, as she welcomed the Secretary's questions with the parting, venomous hope that he might actually learn something from her answers. She had, in front of the entire world, explicitly told the sitting Secretary of State that he needed an education, blissfully unaware that sitting directly in front of him was her Libya file, containing a meticulously documented horror she had never been forced to publicly explain. Secretary Marco Rubio did not react immediately. He simply sat with the profound insult, absorbing it the way a man quietly inspects a hefty bill he did not order, measuring its exact cost and calculating his precise retaliation. Stripped of his suit jacket, with his sleeves practically rolled to the mid-forearm and his glasses resting stoically on the bridge of his nose, his hands remained completely flat on the polished table, flanking a formidable stack of unopened papers. For 3 agonizing seconds, then 4, the utter stillness of his hands served as the only immediate response to her rehearsed arrogance. Then, breaking the oppressive tension, his voice cut through the room, not with the thunderous roar of Kennedy, nor the studied, drawling patience of a Louisiana politician, but with the chilling, rapid-fire quiet of a man prepared to outpace the room's expectations and force the stenographer to scramble. "Mrs. Clinton, you're right," he began, his tone startlingly level. He acknowledged his newcomer status and conceded that he did, in fact, talk a lot, humorously noting that his mother, back in West Miami, had always told him he spoke too much even as a child, and she was usually right about such things. But as he finally opened the ominous folder, the atmosphere shifted violently. "So let me do something different today," he declared, his eyes finally locking on to Clinton's rather than his pages. "Instead of talking, I'm going to read. I'm going to read you what you left behind when you sat in this chair." He invoked the heavy history of his own family, explaining that his parents had fled Cuba for the United States in 1956 because a totalitarian regime was collapsing, and absolutely nobody in the corridors of Washington possessed a coherent plan for the aftermath. He had been raised in a household where the kitchen table stories revolved around the catastrophic reality of what happens to a vulnerable country when a strong man inevitably falls and the architects of his demise fail to plan a single day past the initial toppling. Pulling the very first page from his stack, he leveled a devastating accusation. "You knocked down a strong man, Mrs. Clinton, in Libya in 2011. I'd like to talk about what came after." Beginning with March 2011, Rubio read from the page with blistering precision, delivering each damning fact like a high-caliber round from a weapon firing faster than the human ear could comfortably process, yet never missing its intended mark. He meticulously established that as Secretary of State, she was the primary driving advocate inside the Obama administration for aggressive military intervention in Libya. He methodically listed the towering figures who had opposed her. Secretary of Defense Robert Gates had opposed it publicly. Vice President Biden had fundamentally opposed it. The entire intelligence community had urgently pleaded for caution, and the Joint Chiefs of Staff had expressed deep, systemic reservations. Looking up, his gaze piercing, he stated, "You pushed harder than anyone in the room, and you won the argument." Turning the page to the 20th of October 2011, he detailed the gruesome capture of Muammar Gaddafi by rebel forces in a filthy drainage pipe, bluntly recounting how the dictator was brutally beaten, violently assaulted with a weapon, and subsequently murdered in the open street on camera by the very insurgent forces her policies had armed. Setting the page down, Rubio's voice dropped precipitously, not in volume, but with the terrifying, heavy descent of an airplane suddenly losing altitude just before a crash landing. He reminded her that on that exact day, she had appeared on national television, and when directly asked about Gaddafi's horrific demise, she had gleefully paraphrased Julius Caesar, uttering the infamous words, "We came, we saw, he died." And then, Rubio noted, with a devastating pause, she had laughed. The sheer gravity of the accusation caused a veteran reporter in the second row of the press gallery to slowly set down his coffee, never to pick it back up for the remainder of the grueling session. Rubio relentlessly hammered the profound obscenity of the moment. The leader of a sovereign nation, undeniably a brutal dictator with blood on his hands, whom Rubio explicitly refused to defend, had just been tortured and summarily executed in the dirt. And the chief diplomat of the United States of America had gone on television to treat it as a punchline she had been eagerly saving for the right occasion. Shifting his tone from that of an aggressive prosecutor to a clinical coroner, he opened a new section of the folder and began reading the grim consequences of that laughter, delivering a terrifying body count year by year, cause of death by cause of death. The stunned room absorbed each horrifying metric the way parched soil slowly, and then all at once, absorbs a torrential rain. By 2012, the nation she had supposedly liberated aggressively fractured into competing, bloodthirsty militia fiefdoms, effectively splitting into two rival governments that each claimed total legitimacy while being armed to the teeth with the vast, unsecured weapons arsenal of the man she had helped assassinate. There was absolutely no successor government, primarily because planning for the messy aftermath was the unglamorous part that simply did not make it into the triumphant political speeches. Moving to the 11th of September 2012, he recounted the catastrophic Islamist militant attack on the American diplomatic compound in Benghazi, where Ambassador Chris Stevens, appointed on her watch in the very country she had reshaped, was mercilessly killed, along with Sean Smith, Tyrone Woods, and Glenn Doherty. 4 Americans were left dead in the gaping power vacuum she had personally created, slaughtered by the same rogue militias she had helped arm with the very weapons she had actively helped put into global circulation. In the gallery, an older, gray-haired man wearing a service pin silently folded his arms tightly across his chest, a posture of rigid condemnation he would maintain indefinitely. By 2014, The Islamic State had successfully established a terrifying territorial stronghold right inside Libya, complete with sprawling training camps, massive weapons depots, and a robust recruitment pipeline located a mere 300 miles from the vulnerable southern coast of Europe. As Rubio reached November 2017, his voice dropped even lower, plunging to a chilling whisper, adopting the quiet cadence a person uses when the horrific truth being spoken is simply too heavy to carry at a normal conversational volume. He invoked CNN's harrowing broadcast footage from inside Libya, describing a hellish nighttime scene in a barren parking lot where a terrified group of African men, Ghanaians, Nigerians, Senegalese, and Gambian migrants who had desperately journeyed to Libya seeking safe passage to a better life in Europe were actively being auctioned off like livestock. The auctioneer was actively taking bids, and the final price, Rubio paused, a pause that was not a rhetorical trick, but the genuine hesitation of a man confronting a number that should absolutely not exist in the modern world, was a mere $400 per person. He let the sickening reality hang in the suffocating silence. Human beings were being openly sold at auction in a nation that she had proudly claimed to liberate. The number $400 froze the entire chamber. Absolutely nobody moved, and a diligent reporter in the third row who had been furiously typing since the gavel first fell abruptly stopped, her fingers resting paralyzed over the keys. Rubio mercilessly continued detailing the catastrophic fallout, tracing how the advanced weapons from Gaddafi's plundered arsenal, surface-to-air missiles, rocket-propelled grenades, and heavily armored vehicles flowed uncontrollably south and east immediately following the regime's collapse. These lethal stockpiles seamlessly reached Boko Haram in Nigeria, Al-Qaeda affiliates in Mali, and various armed extremist groups sprawling across the vast Sahel. He painted a horrifying picture of an area significantly larger than the entire continental United States, now heavily armed with the unsecured weapons of a military she had systematically helped destroy without ever bothering to secure the aftermath. The United Nations panel had extensively documented this lethal flow, meticulously tracing the serial numbers right back to Gaddafi, unequivocally proving that the ensuing continental chaos was entirely her creation. Furthermore, he detailed the ensuing migrant crisis. Hundreds of thousands of desperate souls fleeing through Libya on dangerously fragile rubber dinghies and rotting wooden fishing boats, attempting to cross the perilous Mediterranean in the pitch black of night. Thousands upon thousands tragically drowned, their bloated bodies washing up on the idyllic beaches of Lampedusa, Lesbos, and the picturesque southern coasts of Italy and Greece. Every single one of those doomed individuals had passed directly through the fractured country she had liberated, only to find their tragic end dying at sea. Setting the final page down, he perfectly aligned it with the others, creating a stark row of white paper against the dark, polished wood, each individual page representing a disastrous year. He sharply reminded her that prior to her forceful intervention, Libya possessed the highest human development index in all of Africa, boasting free education through university, free universal health care, functioning infrastructure, and operational courts. He reiterated fiercely that he would not stand there and whitewash the horrific crimes of Gaddafi, a brutal tyrant, but he insisted on the undeniable fact that it was a functioning state that held together and where citizens were absolutely not being sold into slavery in dark parking lots. Now, it was a completely failed state, harboring open, active slave markets, and with his hands planted firmly on the table exactly as they had been since the onslaught began, he coldly declared that this dystopian nightmare was exactly what her careless laughter had purchased. Leaning aggressively toward her microphone, Clinton's voice resonated with the practiced weight and unyielding deliberation of a powerful woman who had rigorously defended this exact decision countless times in elite rooms that mattered, and who had confidently survived every single one of those interrogations. She forcefully argued that Gaddafi was mercilessly marching on Benghazi, having explicitly promised to hunt down his own civilian population like rats in the streets. She vehemently pointed out that it was the United Nations Security Council, not acting unilaterally as the United States, that had officially authorized the kinetic military action, and that it was our crucial European allies, specifically France and Britain, who had aggressively led the urgent call to arms. She framed the intervention not as an isolated American war, but as a broad, necessary international coalition acting swiftly and decisively to prevent a looming humanitarian catastrophe. With her jaw firmly set, she dismissed the very notion that the United States should have stood idly by and watched from a comfortable distance while a mad dictator systematically massacred innocent civilians in their own homes, labeling such a stance as an utterly unserious diplomatic position. Acknowledging that every foreign intervention invariably carries unforeseen consequences, she sternly reminded the committee that the dire alternative was not a peaceful nothingness. The horrific alternative was another Srebrenica, another Rwandan genocide, and she was absolutely determined not to let such an atrocity happen on her watch. Behind her, a loyal Democratic staffer smugly adjusted a folder on the desk, a small, deeply unconscious gesture indicative of a camp that smugly believed they had just successfully reestablished the moral high ground. Rubio patiently waited for the patronizing gesture to conclude before responding with a terrifyingly quiet intensity, pointing out that people were still dying in staggering numbers, except now they were simply perishing in open-air slave markets instead of in their own living rooms. She hadn't prevented death, she had merely relocated it. The staffer's hand instantly froze on the folder, never to move again for the remainder of the session. Declaring he had one final, crucial document to read, Rubio reached deliberately beneath his meticulously ordered stack and extracted a single, heavy stock page. It was an official State Department cable, complete with a stark classification stamp, a routing number, and the dense, bureaucratic formatting intentionally designed by Washington insiders to make catastrophic warnings look completely indistinguishable from mundane, routine paperwork. He identified it as a high-level cable sent directly from the Bureau of Near Eastern Affairs to her personal office on the 14th of March 2011, a mere 3 days before the critical UN Security Council vote, and exactly 5 days before the very first American bomb detonated on Libyan soil. Adjusting his glasses, Rubio proceeded to read the prophetic cable with the solemn, devastating gravity of a lawyer executing a final will, fully understanding that every single clause he read aloud was permanently altering the political reality of everyone in the room. The document explicitly warned that if Gaddafi were to be removed, there would be absolutely no viable successor government waiting in the wings. It clearly stated that the rebel coalition was hopelessly fractured along volatile, tribal, regional, and ideological lines, and completely lacked the institutional capacity required to successfully govern a post-conflict nation. Most damningly, it unequivocally predicted that without a massive, sustained international ground presence and a robust, multi-year stabilization and governance plan, Libya would inevitably fracture into violent, militia-controlled zones within a terrifyingly short window of 12 to 18 months. The cable's authors strongly recommended conditioning any kinetic military action on the establishment of a concrete post-conflict governance framework, explicitly warning that proceeding blindly risked the catastrophic creation of a massive failed state in North Africa, located a mere 300 miles from the vulnerable shores of Europe. When Rubio gently placed the classified cable back onto the desk, the heavy paper made a soft, sickening sound against the wood, the unmistakable sound of a devastating truth finally landing after being suspended in the political atmosphere for 15 long, agonizing years. He relentlessly hammered the timeline, the 14th of March, 2011, 3 agonizing days before the international vote, 5 fleeting days before the bombs rained down. Her very own Bureau of Near Eastern Affairs, the dedicated career professionals whose entire livelihood revolves around understanding the nuanced complexities of the region, who tirelessly read the localized cables, speak the native languages, and cultivate the critical on-the-ground contacts, had explicitly told her in official writing on a heavily classified document that Libya would devolve into a failed state in a matter of months if there was no plan. Pausing to let the sheer accuracy of their unheeded warnings sink in, he coldly noted that they were almost perfectly correct. The total collapse took 14 months instead of 12. But the true devastation came when he lifted a second page, a direct printout of that very same original cable. But this copy bore a glaring, handwritten note scrawled furiously in the margin. The distinct handwriting was large, heavily slanted, and obviously written at breakneck speed, visible even to the terrified staffers huddled at the very back of the cavernous room. It was the undeniable script of an incredibly powerful person impatiently annotating a critical memo while rushing to a high-stakes meeting, simply unwilling to dedicate the time required to compose a thoughtful, proper response to a geopolitical catastrophe. It was Clinton's own response, and Rubio mercilessly read both damning lines aloud into the congressional record. "We can't let Gaddafi survive this. The French are moving," followed immediately by, "If we don't lead, they lead, move forward." Setting the two documents side by side, Rubio masterfully constructed the ultimate indictment. On the left, the desperate, expert warning of a guaranteed failed state within 18 months lying practically on Europe's doorstep. On the right, her shockingly callous, ego-driven response ordering the military machine to move forward simply because she feared the French might seize the international credit if America hesitated. He repeated the phrase without theatrical emphasis, allowing the raw, historical ugliness of the words to seep into the permanent record, ensuring they would outlast the very walls of the room. Her overriding concern, he meticulously pointed out while folding his hands, was never the safety of the Libyan people, nor the catastrophic tribal fractures her own experts had explicitly warned her about, nor the impending countdown to a total collapse, nor the dangerous absence of a successor, nor the flooding of advanced weaponry into the hands of brutal militias. Tapping the damning cable just once with his index finger, he emphasized that her dedicated government employees had done absolutely everything within their bureaucratic power to force a person in ultimate authority to heed a desperate warning. They wrote it down, dated it, filed it on official letterhead, and her sole disastrous reaction was to scribble 2 dismissive words: "Move forward." Consequently, the American bombs fell. The brutal slave markets opened for business, and 60,000 innocent people lost their lives in the shattered country she broke entirely because she was politically terrified that the French might break it first. Her own State Department had practically begged her to reconsider, and she had literally written "move forward" in the margin. Standing up, Rubio did not perform the theatrical pacing favored by political showmen. Instead, he anchored himself firmly behind his leather chair, gripping the heavy wood with both hands like a man desperately holding onto a safety railing while peering over the terrifying edge of an abyss. He sought to end the brutal interrogation exactly where it had begun, returning to the horrifying timeline of the 20th of October 2011 and repeating the infamous soundbite, "We came, we saw, he died," followed by a shorter, sharper pause to emphasize the subsequent laughter. He painted the agonizing reality of the wreckage that followed that cavalier laughter. A completely failed state devoid of any functioning government, where heavily armed militias relentlessly fought over the rotting corpse of a country that had once actually worked. It was a chaotic hellscape where advanced American-supplied weaponry flowed freely to ISIS, Boko Haram, and Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, facilitating the rise of literal slave markets in Tripoli, Sabah, and Bani Walid. He humanized the victims, describing how Black Africans, living, breathing human beings with real names, grieving mothers, and blood identical to her own, were currently being stood up under harsh fluorescent lights in filthy parking lots and auctioned off to the highest criminal bidder for a mere $400. His knuckles whitened as his grip on the chair tightened, summarizing the fallout. A massive migrant crisis that forced hundreds of thousands of desperate souls onto flimsy rubber boats in the unforgiving Mediterranean, resulting in thousands of agonizing, drowning deaths and the brutal, preventable murder of an American ambassador trapped in the violent wreckage she had personally engineered. Invoking his deeply personal roots, he described growing up in West Miami in a household where Cuba wasn't merely a geographic location on a map, but an open, bleeding wound. His parents had abandoned Havana in 1956 precisely because a regime was actively collapsing, and the supposedly brilliant American diplomats who thought they knew what was best for a foreign land had absolutely no contingency plan for the devastating aftermath. His father had tirelessly worked as a humble bartender, his mother as a dedicated hotel maid, completely rebuilding their shattered lives from the ground up in a compassionate nation that allowed them entry. And every single night at their kitchen table, the agonizing story remained identical. What truly happens when immense powers break a fragile country and simply walk away? Though his voice remained steady and his grip unyielding, his broad shoulders shifted forward slightly, adopting the unmistakable posture of a weary man leaning into a fierce, invisible wind. "You broke Libya, Mrs. Clinton," he declared with quiet fury, stating that she broke it, laughed about the destruction on global camera with the chilling cadence of a sociopathic Roman emperor, and then simply went home, never to return. Meanwhile, the innocent people she had proudly told the watching world she was supposedly saving had been trapped living inside the hellish wreckage of her arrogant laughter for 15 agonizing years, a decade and a half devoid of government, law, safety, or future, culminating in the horrific reality of 21st century slavery, all because she was petty enough to fear the French arriving first. Sitting back down heavily without removing his glasses or performing any signature theatrical gesture, he allowed the immense gravity of his words to seal the room. He confessed he lacked any folksy political metaphors or folksy Louisiana analogies. He only possessed a devastating number, 60,000 dead, and a single haunting sound, her laughter. He ruthlessly promised that those two terrifying concepts would permanently reside in the exact same sentence for the remainder of recorded history, and there was absolutely nothing she, he, or anyone in the entire Capitol building could ever do to separate them. When the stunned chairman finally asked Mrs. Clinton if she wished to respond to the devastating barrage, she slowly opened her mouth and instinctively began her heavily rehearsed defense. "I take responsibility for." But the sentence abruptly died in her throat. The halting of her words was profoundly different from any momentary pause that had ever occurred in the long history of congressional hearings. She did not stop because she merely forgot a word, nor because the statement was inherently dangerous, but because the very concept of responsibility had instantaneously mutated and lost its protective meaning while resting on her tongue. She had comfortably uttered the phrase, "I take responsibility about Libya" 100 times before, practicing the line in front of mirrors and cameras until the sheer repetition made it feel like genuine conviction, which in turn made it feel like objective truth, ultimately making it feel like it was enough to absolve her. But on this particular day, confronted by the physical reality of the damning State Department cable resting on the table, bearing the undeniably reckless command, "Move forward," scribbled in her own hasty handwriting, and with the ghostly echo of her own callous laughter playing on an endless, maddening loop in the dark recesses of her skull, the hollow phrase could no longer shield her. Under the crushing weight of reality, "I take responsibility," suddenly meant something horrific. It meant acknowledging that she was explicitly warned in writing by her own top intelligence officials, and she actively chose to bomb a fragile country into oblivion anyway, simply because the French military was maneuvering and she desperately refused to be perceived as second. Unable to finish the damning sentence, her heavily rehearsed face remained utterly rigid, meticulously trained across 3 decades of intense media scrutiny to never betray a single micro-expression of panic. Her hands remained perfectly still, her spine refused to bend, but betraying everything, her eyes slowly closed. It was not a mere involuntary blink, but a prolonged, agonizing shutting of the eyelids, lasting 3/4 of a second, the exact type of profound psychological retreat that high-definition cameras capture from the front row and political viewers obsessively replay on endless loops until they are absolutely certain they witnessed the precise moment a powerful person's soul fractured to completely escape the physical reality of the room she was trapped in. When her eyelids finally lifted and her dilated pupils desperately sought focus, she refused to look at her interrogator, the chairman, or the blinding array of cameras. Instead, her haunted gaze remained locked downwards on the polished table, fixated entirely on the damning cable and the 2 arrogant words she had carelessly scrawled in the margin of a desperate warning 15 years prior. "I have addressed this matter," she finally croaked, desperately trying to maintain the identical temperature and robotic precision of her famous voice, utterly failing to acknowledge that in all her previous testimonies, this specific apocalyptic cable had never once been made public. Her hollow deflection was no longer a viable answer. It was merely the desperate sound of a heavy door being slammed shut on a room that had already been violently blasted open for the entire world to see, echoing loudly through the halls of power as the undeniable sound of a woman who had finally run out of dark rooms to retreat to. The explosive clip shattered all modern political metrics, racking up an astonishing 60 million views within a mere 48 hours. The brutally condensed 60-second version, dubbed The Laughter, featured Rubio's relentless machine gun delivery of the damning facts. "We came, we saw, he died," violently intercut with the horrifying imagery of $400 slave markets, the devastating phrase, "the wreckage of your laughter," and the original stomach-churning 2011 footage of Clinton's arrogant chuckling. It rapidly became the single most shared political clip of the entire quarter, forcing the panicked House Foreign Affairs Committee to instantly announce a massive formal inquiry into all pre-intervention communications regarding Libya, focusing intensely on the newly uncovered cables between the Bureau of Near Eastern Affairs and the Secretary's office. Subpoenas were immediately issued, and even 2 prominent Democratic committee members, one of whom had actually served as a critical co-chair of Hillary Clinton's 2016 presidential campaign, were forced by sheer public outrage to release scathing statements demanding a full, unredacted accounting of the horrific decision-making process. The phrase "move forward" instantly metastasized into a massive viral hashtag, a ubiquitous protest sign, and the rare type of cultural condemnation that permanently outlives the fleeting news cycle that birthed it. Thousands of miles away, deep in a grimy alleyway, behind a sweltering restaurant kitchen in Naples, Italy, 2 9-year-old man named Kwame stood shivering in the dark on his brief 5-minute break, quietly watching the explosive American clip on a phone with a badly cracked screen. Originally from Accra, Ghana, he had sacrificed everything in 2018 at the age of 21, paying a ruthless smuggler €400 every single CD he had meticulously saved from 2 grueling years of selling cheap phone chargers in the sweltering Makola market, just to secure passage through the living hell of Libya to the coast. He had risked death for a perilous boat ride to Italy, desperately seeking a future that did not involve rotting away in a market stall for the remainder of his natural life. The fragile boat eventually came, but the horrific journey through the Libyan wasteland was the unspeakable nightmare the smuggler had conveniently omitted. Kwame had spent 4 agonizing months trapped in a brutal detention center near Tripoli, a massive, filthy warehouse guarded by heavily armed, sadistic militiamen. What unspeakable atrocities occurred inside the darkness of that warehouse, he absolutely never discussed with a living soul, not with the indifferent Italian immigration officer who coldly stamped his asylum papers, not with the fellow Ghanaians who worked alongside him in the grease-filled restaurant and shared his cramped, freezing apartment near the roaring train station, and certainly not with his terrified mother when she called every Sunday from Accra just to ask if her boy was eating enough. He had only uttered a single haunting sentence about his nightmare once, whispering to a fellow dishwasher while dragging heavy trash bags to the dumpster at the bitter end of an exhausting shift. They sold people. The man he confessed to did not dare ask him to elaborate, instinctively understanding that the horrific sentence required absolutely no further context in a broken world. Standing in the cold Italian alleyway, Kwame watched the tiny, cracked screen as the powerful American politician stared down the camera and uttered the terrifying number $400, and his exhausted, scarred thumb instinctively slammed the pause button, freezing the surreal image in place. He stared blankly at Rubio's open mouth, the horrifying price tag hanging suspended in the digital air between 2 incredibly wealthy, powerful people wearing immaculate suits inside a majestic room built of solid marble and adorned with pristine flags. Slowly, Kwame looked away from the glowing screen and stared down at his own trembling hands, rough, calloused hands that had tirelessly washed thousands of filthy dishes, furiously mopped grease-stained floors, and scrubbed industrial pots in this grueling kitchen for 6 long years. They were hands severely cracked by harsh industrial soap, permanently reddened by scalding hot water, and deeply scarred across the left palm from a vicious burn he suffered during his very first week because he didn't yet understand the dangerous splash pattern of the deep fryer. He realized with a sickening clarity that these very hands, his entire existence, were valued at exactly $400 in a blood-soaked parking lot in Tripoli, a mere €9 an hour in a miserable kitchen in Naples, and fundamentally worth both absolutely everything and entirely nothing, entirely dependent on which chaotic country you happened to be standing in and exactly who was holding the loaded gun. $400 was the literal price of his humanity in the very country the American Secretary of State had arrogantly laughed about liberating. Quietly slipping the phone back into his worn pocket, he turned around and walked back into the suffocating heat of the kitchen, fully aware that the endless piles of dirty dishes were never going to wash themselves. Meanwhile, halfway across the globe in a majestic hearing room he would never be allowed to set foot in, a furious man descended from Cuban refugees was fiercely telling a wealthy woman from Connecticut exactly the magnitude of the devastation her careless laughter had wrought, boldly declaring the death toll to be 60,000. But Kwame knew deep in his bones that the horrific number was fundamentally wrong. The tally completely failed to include him because he had miraculously survived the slaughter, and the broken survivors of American foreign policy are simply never counted in the neat official tallies of the dead. They are merely left to wash dishes in the shadows of Naples, taking desperate breaks with cracked phones, bearing jagged scars on their palms, and burying traumatic memories they will fiercely refuse to ever discuss. Back in his secure office at the State Department, long after the cameras had been shut down, Marco Rubio quietly picked up the phone and called his wife, Jeanette. He didn't brag about the viral hearing or his political triumph. Instead, he spoke softly about the ghosts of Cuba, about his father Mario, who had tirelessly worked as a humble bartender at the glamorous Rooney Plaza Hotel in Miami Beach, coming home late every single night smelling heavily of stale lime, rich cigar smoke, and bone-deep exhaustion. He spoke of the terrifying year 1956 and the unimaginably long, desperate drive from absolute nothingness to the fragile promise of something that his brave parents had undertaken across the vast width of a compassionate country that took them in and asked for nothing more than hard work and basic honesty. Jeanette, he whispered, the heavy silence on the secure line reflecting the deep, intimate understanding of two people married long enough to let a profound realization fully settle before speaking. They told her it would fail. They sent her a classified cable. They wrote it all out, 12 to 18 months, failed state, no successor, and she just wrote, "Move forward" in the margin and went home. He confessed that it wasn't the ruthless foreign enemies, the looming global crises, or the terrifying midnight emergency calls that scared him about occupying the incredibly powerful chair of the Secretary of State. It was the sheer, unadulterated arrogance of the position. It was the horrifying, lethal arrogance of powerful Washington elites genuinely believing they could magically predict what happens next in a fragile, complicated country they had never bothered to live in and fundamentally never will. Miles away, cloistered in her sprawling estate in Chappaqua, New York, Hillary Clinton sat entirely alone in her dark, silent study, the massive television intentionally powered off, her sleek laptop firmly closed, and the heavy curtains tightly drawn against the outside world. She absolutely did not need to log online to watch the viral clip. She already knew the sound of her own laughter intimately. She had been forced to hear it brutally played back to her 1,000 excruciating times since that fateful day in 2011 broadcast, relentlessly on endless cable news segments, weaponized mercilessly on high-stakes debate stages, and screamed from the furious mouths of countless protesters who hoisted massive signs bearing her face with the word Libya painted aggressively underneath. The sinister laughter had stalked her relentlessly for 15 long years, following her like a dark cloud into a grueling presidential campaign and dragging her out the other side in defeat. It had pursued her deep into her supposedly quiet retirement, slipping seamlessly through the heavy oak door of this very room, and now it sat comfortably in the suffocating darkness, occupying the chair directly across from her like a malevolent, uninvited guest who simply refused to ever leave. But today, the nightmare had acquired a terrifying new soundtrack. The horrific reality of slave markets, the sickening price tag of $400, the devastating phrase, "the wreckage of your laughter," and the damning handwritten command to move forward. She sat completely paralyzed in the heavy silence, with all of it closing in on her, realizing with absolute dread that the haunting laughter was the single, inescapable thing in the entire room she could never simply turn off, because it was undeniably her own voice, forever immortalized on the permanent, unforgiving historical record. And no amount of calculated political spin, no legion of loyal staffers, and no amount of practiced, evasive previous testimony would ever possess the power to make it sound like anything other than exactly what it truly was. An incredibly powerful woman gleefully laughing about the total bloody destruction of a sovereign country she had absolutely no intention of ever helping to rebuild. She had laughed while an empire burned, uttering, "We came, we saw, he died," and 15 years later, the ashes had finally reached her doorstep in the form of a totally failed state. 60,000 rotting corpses and open-air slave markets where living, breathing human beings were sold like cattle for a mere $400. As the crushing weight of her irreversible legacy finally suffocated the remaining air out of the dark, isolated study, a single, unanswerable question hung violently in the tense silence when the entire world finally realizes that regime change is not a clever political punchline, but a catalyst for unspeakable human horror. Who exactly will be held accountable when the people living in the wreckage finally decide to strike back?